the Israelites, have been kept in slavery for a very long time in the land of Egypt. The Pharaoh was warned several times to let them go, but he kept declining, and he would have kept refusing unless it were not for the hand of the Lord crushing the land of Egypt. The Pharaoh and his people in the most atrocious of ways, and so did he. Turn the water of the Nile and of every jar into blood. Then make millions of frogs come out of it. Then he transformed every speck of dust on the ground into gnats, only to later send massive swarms of flies upon them. Subsequently, he brought death upon the livestock of the farmers. Yet, the Pharaoh still refused to let them go. So God caused boils on the skin of men and animals. He struck both with thunderstorms of hail and fire. He sent swarms of locusts so thick the sky fell into darkness, devouring the small amount of food that was still left. Then, he plunged Egypt into complete darkness for 3 days. At midnight of the third, he released the angel of death, taking the lives of all firstborns, humans and animals alike, including the son of the Pharaoh. Only then did the Pharaoh decide he had lost too much, and that he had no choice but to let the Israelites go. Moses is leading his people, the Israelites, towards the land promised by God. To reach it, however, scorching deserts and dusty mountainous lands must be crossed. This journey from Egypt to the land of Canaan, according to the Bible, will cause the Israelites to wander for 40 years in desolate lands, and will involve the displacement of 2 million people, plus their livestock, all sustained and nourished with provisions from God, particularly with manna, a bread-like food that, according to the Bible, fell daily from the sky, becoming the main component of their diet. As per the biblical account, manna appears in the morning with the dew. It is a white flake-like substance, comparable in size to coriander seeds, but tasting like wafers made with honey. Manna spoils if kept overnight, becoming foul and breeding worms. For this reason, the Israelites were instructed to gather manna daily, as the manna was said to melt as the sun progressively heated the day. Each person was to gather an omer of manna per day, which is approximately 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds. On the 6th day, however, they were to gather twice the amount to prepare for the day of rest, the Sabbath, because manna would not appear that day. Finally, manna could be ground in mills, pounded in mortars, boiled in pots, and used as flour to make bread and cakes. When processed for cooking, to the eyes of the Israelites, it appeared as a resin, specifically like the resin called bdellium. The modern academic consensus largely dismisses the biblical account of the Exodus as a real historical event. The few scholars who accept it, though, postulate that it likely occurred on a much smaller scale, lasting from only a few weeks to a few months, and involving as few as 5,000 to a maximum of 140,000 people, with 20,000 being the most generally accepted number. Despite doubts surrounding the story of the Exodus being historical, the characteristics of manna, as described in the Bible, have sparked great interest among researchers and historians over the centuries. This has led to intense research and speculation to determine if manna truly existed, and if it is a natural phenomenon that still occurs to this day. And this is what was discovered. The first scientific observations of manna begin with the French occupation of Algeria. Between 1840 to 1845, the French government initiated an operation called Mission Scientifique. The mission, led by prominent French archaeologists and historians of the time, aimed to collect comprehensive information about Algeria's geography, natural resources, culture, and history to better understand how to control the region and exploit its resources effectively. This included mapping the terrain, studying the flora and fauna, and documenting the archaeological and cultural sites of the region. On very rare occasions, however, while mapping the deserts, the explorers stumbled upon a highly unusual phenomenon that had not yet been identified, which repeatedly caught their attention. At least once a year, after strong rains, strong winds, sandstorms, or a combination of these, a whitish, grayish substance would fall from the sky. Carried by the winds, this substance would accumulate in depressions such as ravines between mountains, in valleys, or behind the sand dunes of the deserts, forming a thick layer of white, 10 to 20 centimeters, or 4 to 8 inches deep on the ground. This whitish substance appeared as a giant mass composed of small, pea-sized globules, averaging between 5 to 15 millimeters in diameter, or 0.2 to 0.6 inches, appearing as if these globules were fragments of something larger. Additionally, because the substance had a very earthy consistency to the touch, the researchers decided to call it earth secretion. When looking through previous academic reports, the researchers found that, in 1828, a certain professor named Tanar and his colleague, Friedrich Parrot, had allegedly already brought to the attention of the French Academy of Sciences the occurrence of a rain of similar substance near Mount Ararat in Turkey, which, that year, had covered the ground with a thick layer of white, 15 centimeters deep, or 6 inches. Tanar, moreover, provided samples to the Academy, but after a chemical analysis in 1831, no conclusive results could be reached. Other researchers in the Mount Ararat region reported similar events in 1828, 1826, and 1824. Additionally, researchers in the Caspian Sea region, eastern Turkey, and northern and eastern Iran similarly reported the occurrence of analogous phenomena. A particularly unique case, reported by O'Shea Lewa, occurred in the city of Urmia in 1829, where, after a strong thunderstorm, the inhabitants saw a white substance falling from the sky and covering the ground in a 10-centimeter layer of white, or 4 inches deep. The inhabitants also noticed their sheep eating it, and subsequently tried it themselves. Realizing it was edible and surprisingly also sweet, and given that they were experiencing a famine at that time, they considered it a miracle. The researchers of such expedition in Algeria, thus, after carefully reading the reports and conducting a thorough botanical and chemical analysis, concluded that those pea-sized earthy globules could belong to none other than to a very particular type of edible lichen called Lecanora esculenta. A lichen is a complex organism composed of a fungus and an algae, or a cyanobacterium that live together in a relationship of symbiosis. In this relationship, the fungus provides the structure and protection, while the algae, by capturing sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide from the surrounding environment, produces food for both through photosynthesis. A lichen, as such, can grow and survive in the most extreme of environments, like deserts, because first, it doesn't need soil to get its nutrients. It produces them through photosynthesis. And second, it doesn't need much water either, because it absorbs the humidity from the air. The lichen Lecanora esculenta, in particular, grows on limestone-rich mountains, limestone rocky formations, and calcareous soils. Externally, the lichen appears whitish, while internally, it can vary from brownish to whitish. After prolonged periods of drought, the structure of the lichen dries, and its body crumbles into pieces, gradually falling from the mountain walls to the ground. Now, imagine entire groups of mountains harboring this lichen on their walls. When the lichens dry and detach from the mountain walls, strong winds and strong storms can lift the lichen debris from the ground, carry it into the atmosphere, and transport it for several kilometers, if not tens or hundreds of kilometers, in any direction before falling back to the ground. In most cases, due to the low population density of deserts, the lichens simply fall in uninhabited places, out of sight of people, such as behind sand dunes, and no one ever notices. However, in very rare circumstances, they can fall near human settlements. It was noted that, in most cases, a fall of lichen was predominantly and actively discovered by people in areas affected by severe famines. This likely occurred, perhaps, because farmers, due to the temporary infertility of the land, often abandoned their fields and dedicated themselves fully to pastoralism, walking several kilometers a day outside their villages with their livestock, while simultaneously looking for any food they could gather to bring back home to their families. In such circumstances, a shepherd might come across a fall of lichens and not realize they were edible until his livestock began to eat them. Once noticed, the shepherd would call the villagers to gather the lichens from the ground. The researchers found that, where lichens fell in abundant quantities, a person could collect up to 750 grams of lichen per hour, or 1.7 pounds, and 4 to 6 kilograms in a day, or 8.8 to 13.2 pounds. The fundamental problem with the lichen Lecanora esculenta is that, while it grows on rocks, it also absorbs calcium from them, turning it into calcium oxalate and integrating it into its structure. Consequently, the lichen contains a large amount of calcium oxalate. Specifically, 60% of the lichen is made up of calcium oxalate, which, in addition to being indigestible and tasteless, can cause significant intestinal problems and kidney stones in the long term in humans. Additionally, it is sandy to the tongue and has a chalky texture if consumed raw, as it is when freshly collected from the ground. The raw lichen, as it is when freshly collected from the ground, is generally still mixed with sand and dirt, so before eating it, the ancients most likely soaked it in water and boiled it. During the cleaning process, as such, without realizing it, they removed most of the oxalate from the lichen, making it less dangerous for consumption. The remaining 30 to 40% of the lichen is mainly composed of a carbohydrate known as lichinin, which, when processed, looks like a brown resin, of which only 4% is made of sugars, making it slightly sweet. O'Shea Lewa noted that, in the case of the city of Urmia in 1829 Iran, after the lichens were collected from the ground and cleaned, the locals ground them and, depending on their individual availability of wheat flour, the wealthier among them mixed them with flour in a ratio of 3 to 1, while the poorer among them ate bread entirely made of lichen. 100 grams, or 3.5 ounces of bread, made entirely with wheat flour, generally contain 250 calories, while 100 grams of bread made entirely of lichen contains between 100 to 160 calories, depending on the carbohydrate to calcium ratio of the lichen, making lichens nutritionally poor. This may explain why, in the Bible, the Israelites were instructed to collect 1 omer of manna per person per day, which is equivalent to 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds. 1 omer of Lecanora esculenta, in fact, is equivalent to 1,800 to 2,900 calories, which is enough to satisfy the entire daily caloric intake of a person. Historically, the inhabitants of Sistan, Iran, maintained that part of Alexander the Great's army, while crossing through their land, was saved from starvation by eating this lichen, which they called Juz Jondom, literally meaning nut-like wheat. Curiously, once the French army discovered that an edible lichen was freely available during their campaign in Algeria, they reportedly started feeding their horses a mix of lichen and barley. After 3 weeks, having noticed that their horses did not show any health complications, they switched to feeding them only lichen to save on their horse feed supplies. It would be a mistake, though, to think that the French researchers, during the Mission Scientifique of 1840 to 1845 in Algeria, were the first to discover this lichen. While it was studied extensively by the French for the first time, Arab authors of the 9th to 13th centuries are actually the first to discuss this lichen in detail. Ishaq ibn Imran called it dandruff of the stone, stating that the best quality came from the region of Khorasan in Iran. He also noted that those who collected it claimed that it looked like grains of earth, similar to chickpeas, and grayish in color. Muhammad al-Idrisi wrote, "It is something that grows in the deserts, beyond the center of sterile mountains and between stones. It is yellowish in color and does not rise above the soil higher than the size of a fingernail." Al-Idrisi also added that this lichen was powdered and added to water to make it taste sweet. Avicenna, born in Afshona, in the modern region of Bukhara in Uzbekistan, called it grainy earth, and said it was used to make medicines and for wine fermentation. Muhammad al-Ghafiqi, from Andalusia, Spain, called it honey dust and flower of the stone, and noted that it was an exported product. Ibn al-Baitar, born in Malaga, Spain, wrote that the lichen Lecanora esculenta in eastern Spain was known as fat of the earth and honey earth. But when he moved to the city of Raqqa in Syria, the Syrians called it pigeon's droppings. To be clear, the ancient Arab scholars never explicitly linked the concept of biblical and Quranic manna with a lichen. The Arabs, in fact, used this lichen, when available, primarily as a sweetener or as an agent of fermentation. However, in the collection of hadiths Sahih Muslim 2049f, we find a curious detail worth mentioning. Sa'id bin Zaid reports that the Messenger of Allah, Prophet Muhammad, once said, "The truffles are a type of manna that Allah, the Most High, the Majestic, gave to the children of Israel, and that their juice is a medicine for the eyes." Desert truffles, or tefesyache, therefore, similarly to the lichen Lecanora esculenta, are related as both are fungi, suggesting that manna could indeed be a fungus. Returning to the topic, the article we have been using the most so far, The Manna Lichen, Lecanora esculenta, by R.A. Donkin, also notes that the lichen Lecanora esculenta has been employed as a food on many occasions in Asia Minor and Central Asia throughout history. For example, in eastern Turkey, it is known as kudret bogdazi, wonder grain, while in some parts of Iran, it is known as shirzad, milk producer, for being given to nursing mothers. The Kurds called it bread of heaven and bread of the earth, while the Kazakhs called it semyanoi kleb, which means bread of the earth. As you might have understood, the lichen Lecanora esculenta does not only grow in northern Africa, like Algeria, but also as far as Kazakhstan, and along what botanists call the Irano-Turanian region, which includes the Sinai Peninsula, through which Moses supposedly led the Israelites towards the Promised Land. However, while the research of R.A. Donkin and the analysis of French explorers in Algeria and the Caspian region seem to be on the verge of closing the chapter on manna by identifying it once and for all with the lichen, there were still significant inconsistencies between the characteristics of the lichen Lecanora esculenta and the details of the biblical manna that remained essentially unexplained. First, although it had long been established that the Sinai Peninsula hosts the lichen Lecanora esculenta, no explorers were ever sent to confirm whether a similar phenomenon, such as a fall of lichens, had actually ever occurred in the peninsula. Second, Although the physical appearance of the lichen Lecanora esculenta greatly matched the description of biblical manna, there were significant differences in the details. In the Bible, manna is described as a white, flake-like substance that falls daily in the morning with the dew, disappears as the sun progressively warms the day, and spoils if stored overnight. In contrast, lichens are not flake-like, but granular in shape, fall extremely rarely, possibly once a year or once every several years, do not disappear as the day becomes progressively warm, and, when processed into more complex foods, can last for several weeks. The researchers were therefore satisfied, but not convinced enough to close the case. As such, they continued investigating. And this is what they discovered next. While the lichen hypothesis was becoming increasingly popular, in 1927, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, due to the importance of the story of Exodus to the Jewish identity, and in an effort to either confirm the lichen hypothesis or to find a better explanation of the natural cause of manna, commissioned an investigative expedition into the Sinai Peninsula, led by professor and entomologist Dr. Shimon Fritz Bodenheimer. When Bodenheimer arrived in the Sinai Peninsula, he retraced the same route that Moses and the Israelites had walked during the Exodus. He revisited the same oases, the same mountains, the same places. Along the way, he consulted the local Bedouins, asking if they had ever come across a fall of lichens. However, the Bedouins denied ever seeing or hearing from their ancestors. Even the Greek Orthodox monks of the monastery of St. Catherine, founded in the 6th century AD in Sinai, had no records of any such event since its foundation, suggesting that for at least 1,300 years up to that point, a fall of lichens had likely never occurred. Therefore, the lichen hypothesis, becoming increasingly improbable, had to be set aside. What now? What else could explain the biblical manna, filling the gaps left by the lichen theory once and for all? The fact that the Hebrew University of Jerusalem chose to send Dr. Shimon Fritz Bodenheimer, an entomologist who is an expert of insects, to explore the Sinai Peninsula rather than a botanist or any other type of expert may seem paradoxical. Why exactly an expert of insects? It was, though, a calculated move. You must know, in fact, that up to that point, medieval Arab and Latin physicians, starting with Avicenna in the 11th century, had been investigating the possible origins of manna for almost 1,000 years. Avicenna, perhaps due to religious influence or common belief, claimed that manna was a white substance like dew that rained down from the sky only on certain rocks, plants, and trees. Generally, substances do not rain exclusively on very specific objects. As such, centuries later, Ibn al-Baitar, Conrad of Megenberg, and popular Latin herbals, such as the Herbaeus mocantinus and the Guard der Gesundheit of the 15th century, corrected this view by observing that no dew was actually falling from the sky only on plants and trees, but rather that the trees and plants themselves were secreting a white, resin-like substance from within, which would then drip and cling to branches and leaves before solidifying, appearing as if the substance had fallen from the sky. In the 16th century, for example, in the arid lands of southern Italy, Calabrian and Sicilian farmers would cultivate hundreds of ash trees, make cuts in their trunks, and collect the sap that dripped from them. Once solidified, they would sell the solidified sap in the local markets under the name of manna. At first glance, this might seem like a clever marketing tactic of the time, or, why not, a scam. However, the reality is that, from the 15th century onwards, both botanists and scholars alike had already widely agreed that manna was synonymous with any sweet secretion from plants and trees that could be eaten. Bodenheimer, in fact, even before his departure, was instructed to closely examine a very specific tree, common to the arid and desert lands of northern Africa, Sinai, and Eurasia. A tree that the locals in the Sinai called in Arabic tarfa, known in English as Tamarisk, from the Latin Tamarix, because it was said to lose sap on its own, only for a few months a year, specifically from mid-June to late July. The fact is that a tree generally does not drip sap on its own, unless its structure is compromised by external factors. To make trees drip sap, as we learned from the techniques used by Sicilian and Calabrian farmers on ash trees, human intervention is required. Perforations or incisions on the trunk must be made. So, how could a tree lose sap on its own in the middle of the desert, unless something other than a human damaged it? Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg, 120 years before the Hebrew University of Jerusalem's expedition into the Sinai, and preceding Bodenheimer, tried to demonstrate that the loss of sap was caused by an external factor. Ehrenberg closely analyzed Tamarisk trees and noticed that some very small insects were sucking the sap from the trees by creating holes in their branches. From these suction holes, sap seemed to flow, so Ehrenberg hypothesized that it was indeed the insects causing the manna to spill out, and thus called those insects Coccus manniparus, literally manna-producing scale insect. Was Ehrenberg, however, correct? We could say yes, but not in the way Ehrenberg might have expected. Bodenheimer, in fact, after a close examination, determined that those insects were actually colonies of aphids, specifically of Coccus manniparus in the mountains, insect which was renamed into Trabutina mannipara, and of Neococcus serpentinus in the lowlands. Aphids suck large amounts of sap from the branches of the tamarisk trees because their sap is rich in carbohydrates, but extremely poor in nitrogen. Since aphids need a minimum amount of nitrogen for their metabolism to work properly, they consume sap in great excess until they reach their minimum nitrogen requirement. During their suction, the excess carbohydrates pass through their bodies and, eventually, through their anus, forming what is technically known as honeydew secretion, which is edible and very sweet, composed of 90% sugars. Due to the dry air of the desert, honeydew drops later solidify into white flake-like grains, which then turn yellowish, then brownish due to oxidation. The honeydew grains fall to the ground around the tree and remain there unless strong winds carry them farther away. Now, how does the honeydew of aphids theory compare to the biblical manna? The biblical manna was discovered by the Israelites on the 15th day of the second month after their exodus from Egypt, which corresponds to the middle or end of the Egyptian month of Siwan, that is, from late May to early June. Aphids begin secreting honeydew on tamarisk trees from late May to early June, aligning with the biblical description. The biblical manna appears in the morning with the dew. Aphids are mostly active during the night, during which they secrete honeydew. The honeydew grains then fall from the tree to the ground and accumulate, forming a thin layer of white on the ground that people notice in the morning, consistent with the biblical description. Biblical manna is described as a white, flaky substance, comparable in size to coriander seeds, and tasting like wafers made with honey. The honeydew of aphids is a white substance composed of flake-like grains, similar in size to seeds, which taste like honey, aligning with the biblical description. The biblical manna disappears as the sun progressively warms the day, purportedly melting the manna away from the ground. Around 8 to 9 a.m., when the ground reaches 21 degrees Celsius, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, Bodenheimer observed that swarms of ants would immediately rush in to quickly collect the honeydew grains from the ground, giving the impression that the grains disappeared as the sun gradually increased the temperature of the day. However, the ants would cease their activity early in the afternoon, allowing the honeydew to accumulate on the ground during the night. According to Bodenheimer, in addition, the term melting in the biblical translation might be a misinterpretation by the biblical authors or translators, with fading away being a more accurate description. Each person was to gather an omer of manna per day, equivalent to 1.8 kilograms or 4 pounds. Bodenheimer, truth be told, during his expedition, found it difficult to collect more than 1 kilogram per person per day, or 2.2 pounds, diverging significantly from the biblical description. Antonin de Guglielmo, a Catholic researcher, in his article, What Was the Manna?, states, though that soil analyses conducted in the peninsula have shown a different temperature during the Exodus, suggesting a greener Sinai at that time, which could have supported many more trees and, as a consequence, a greater production of honeydew. On day 6, each person was to gather twice as much manna to prepare for the day of rest, the Sabbath, as no manna would appear that day. Honeydew, however, falls daily. Both Bodenheimer and Antonin de Guglielmo agree that this detail was most likely invented by biblical authors to comply with the Jewish commandment not to work or perform activities on the day of rest, the Sabbath. Biblical manna spoils if kept overnight, becoming foul and breeding worms. Bodenheimer explains that the word worm, used in the biblical translation, tola, is a misinterpretation derived from a misunderstanding of the oral tradition. In Hebrew, ants are called nemala. But when the local Bedouins taught Bodenheimer about the Tamarisk trees present in their lands, the Bedouins referred to ants in Arabic as dudi, a word equivalent to the Hebrew word tolat, meaning worm or larva. Out of curiosity, when Bodenheimer asked the Bedouins if they had a term similar to nemala for ants, the Bedouins acknowledged that they also called them namla. Therefore, the locals tend to call a wide range of insects worms, which explains the misinterpretation by the biblical translators of the local oral tradition. Additionally, Bodenheimer adds that the detail of breeding worms, and hence of breeding ants, clearly shows how the Israelites had a hard time storing manna, most likely because they had very primitive tents that ants could easily invade to take away their manna. And possibly the controversial point is that in Exodus 16:4, God says that he will rain bread from heaven, referring to manna, for the Israelites. The word bread represents a staple food, suggesting an enormous amount of food falling from the sky, likely enough to fully satiate the Israelites. However, manna, due to the scarcity of trees in the peninsula, as we have just seen, would have been more of a rarity, if not a delicacy. Bodenheimer explains that although the word lechem, translated as bread in the biblical verse, is correct, this word also has a secondary meaning of food in general. At that time, Bodenheimer says lechem, most likely referring to any type of food rather than a specific food like bread. As such, when God says, "I will rain bread from heaven," he most likely means that he will support the Israelites with any kind of food. Indeed, Bodenheimer asserts that the word lechem in Hebrew is so generic that the cognate Arabic word lahm actually means meat. Catholic researcher Antonin de Guglielmo, in his work, What Was the Manna?, clarifies that the Bible never explicitly states that the Israelites ate manna and manna only, every day, for 40 consecutive years. De Guglielmo argues that the Israelites most likely consumed it only during the months of June and July, when manna was seasonally available. He also points out that Yahweh provides the Israelites with quails, and that they left Egypt with their livestock, suggesting they probably regularly consumed milk and meat as well. Additionally, De Guglielmo notes that the Bible never declares manna to be a supernatural food either, making it plausible, he argues, to identify it with a natural phenomenon. Although the Bible suggests that manna was provided in quantities that seem supernatural at first glance, this could be attributed to climate changes as discussed earlier. Both Bodenheimer and de Guglielmo, in final instance, agree that the Israelites, during the Exodus, maintained a predominantly pastoral lifestyle, similar to that of the nomadic peoples living in the Central Asian steppes, such as the Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and the nomadic Mongols. According to Bodenheimer, lastly, the reason why manna was recorded in history and became so fundamental to the story of the Exodus lies in the very simple fact that manna, paradoxically, was the only sweet thing the Israelites could find in the desert. Bodenheimer recounts, "Only those who have lived with the Bedouins for a certain length of time will understand how finding anything sweet while wandering the desert can easily become the most precious moment of the day." This explains how manna, being one of the few sweet resources available in relevant quantities in the deserts, in this case the Sinai Peninsula, ended up playing such a central role in the narrative of the biblical story of the Exodus. If the conclusion, manna equals insect droppings, still seems strange or improbable, consider this. What does manna really mean, in the first instance, etymologically? The current most accepted hypothesis is that the word manna does not derive from Hebrew, but from the Aramaic compound manhu, which could be a question like, what is this? Moreover, if the Aramaic word man is related to the Arabic word man, then we already have an answer. In Arabic, man means aphids, so manna or manhu could literally mean these are aphids, while their product, honeydew, or man al-sama in Arabic, literally means manna of the heavens. Finally, some cicadas, belonging to the Homoptera group, are also present in the Sinai Peninsula, southern Iraq, and Iran. These cicadas, which produce sweet secretions similar to those of aphids, are also called man by the locals. During Bodenheimer's period, he reported that there were vendors in the city of Baghdad, Iraq, who sold sweets and pastry products under the name man, and that Kurdistan, at that time, was the largest producer of manna in the Middle East. Researching, writing, voiceover, and editing videos like these require a substantial amount of time, effort, and resources. Specifically, a combined effort of 2 months for this video alone. We are a small team of 3, and YouTube ad revenue falls very short of covering our operational costs. If you find these videos informative and worthwhile, please consider supporting our work through Patreon, or with a super thanks here on YouTube. Thank you for watching. We hope we have addressed most of the doubts you may have had about this topic. Congratulations for reaching the end. Lastly, we wish you a wonderful day.